As always, it's very beautiful. And good morning.
Good morning.
I have to say that this week has not gone my way. And sometimes I've had to sit back and think, when things don't go your way, like especially when your kids are sick and your family's sick and you have to be up Sunday morning bright and early and be prepared, and all of a sudden you're sitting there going, I'm panicked. And then you realize that God knows what He's doing as He changes your service. I was listening as we sang Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace happens to be one of my favorite songs. And I know it was a last-minute change this morning. But the story of how Amazing Grace was written fits in perfectly with the sermon today. See, John Newton was raised in England. He lost his mother at a young age, and then was eventually forced into working for the British Navy. Not something anybody wants to do. Was not something anybody signed up to do, so they forced everybody. Then from there, he gets kicked off and gets sold into slavery. And eventually he gets out of that and he becomes the person taking the slaves. He is at a point, though, where he is hopeless one night. He feels so discouraged. He has gone so far away from God that he sees no answer in Him. And that is in that moment when Amazing Grace came down and touched him, and God redeemed him. And as we go through the story, we've been looking at Judges, and Judges is definitely a theme. There's a lot of redemptive acts, a lot of redemption that happens, and a lot of failures. So when we look at Judges chapter 13, which starts the story of Samson, we see that again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. I don't know about you, but with my kids, they typically make the same mistake a couple times, maybe more than a couple times. I have a 3-year-old who, doesn't matter how many times you tell him not to touch something, he is right there the second you turn your back. I don't think anybody else understands that. I'm sure nobody did that as a kid, right? They continually go back and forth. But there comes a point when we get so busy, so lost in what we're doing wrong, that we don't think our parents can forgive us anymore. I remember as a kid, I put on a good show, but I wasn't that perfect. And 4th grade was that year. And there was a few things I did. I've told our kids in kids' church about a couple of them as examples of what not to do. But I was not the best student. I struggled with school, and so I found out that in the back of my book was all the answers, especially for math. I hate math. I still hate math, and I work it all day. So I don't know how that worked out, but it works. And God was working on me, but I was so caught up in the cycle of it that I didn't really think that there was any chance of it stopping. It was so desperate, and this is where Israel is. They have done wrong again. And now they are at a point where they just don't think there's any hope. There's nothing around them. They have been conquered once again, and this time by the Philistines. And we hear about the Philistines as we go further into Scripture with David and Goliath, and we know that they're a huge army. We know that they're strong, they're fierce. They are a really tough nation. They're also very religious. They were a very religious nation. They had a couple gods. They had Dagon, who we hear about with David, some of the stories there. They had Baal. They carried their idols into battle. They were a very religious group. And here's the Israelites who were constantly falling away from God. They were hopeless. They lived in a hopeless resignation of rejection by God. They figured God was going to reject them. They had done this so many times that they even themselves thought that they couldn't be saved. So they didn't even bother to call out to God this time. They didn't do anything. They, as a nation, wanted to cease to exist. They wanted to just cease. They couldn't get over the irresistible evil, despite knowing that God had rescued them time and time again. Our God, though, is not a God who quits. Our God is a God who always has a plan. He has a plan of redemption. And when we get to verse 2, we meet a couple. Because God has chosen to redeem Israel, He has chosen a couple to do something special. And it says in Genesis chapter 13, 2 through 14, it reads, "A certain man of Zorah, named Manoah, from the clan of the Danites, had a wife who was childless, unable to give birth. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, 'You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is to never be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be raised a Nazarene, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines.' Then the woman went to her husband and told him, 'A man of God came to me. He looked like an angel of God, very awesome. I didn't ask him where he came from. He didn't tell me his name. But he said to me, "You will become pregnant and have a son. Now then, drink no wine or other fermented drink, or eat anything unclean, because the boy will be a Nazarene of God from the womb until the day of his death." Then Manoah prayed to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I beg you to let the man of God you sent us to come again to teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born." God heard Manoah, and the angel of God came to the woman while she was out in the field, but her husband Manoah was not with her. The woman hurried to tell her husband, "He is here, the man who appeared to me the other day." Manoah got up, followed his wife, and when he came to the man, he said, "Are you the man who talked to my wife?" So Manoah asked him, "When your words are fulfilled, what is to be the rule that governs the boy's life and work?" The angel of the Lord answered, "Your wife must do all that I have told her. She must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, nor drink any wine or other fermented drink, or eat anything that is unclean. She must do everything that I have commanded her." God was setting aside Samson as someone who was to redeem Israel. Israel didn't ask for this redeemer, and he by no means was a perfect redeemer. But he was a precursor, a forecoming of Christ and his redemptive power in our lives. God wanted to redeem Israel even when Israel didn't know how to ask for that redemption. They were so lost. So when we meet Manoah and his wife, there's a couple things that stand out. One, they were unable to have children. This is not the first time in the Bible that we read about a family who desperately wants a child, who has prayed for a child or desired a child, and God steps in. My kids are very special to me. And many years ago, long before Daniel and I were married, we were told that there was no chance I could have kids. And over the years, we kind of prepared for that. And then we got pregnant with Elmarie. And I was ecstatic. I always wanted to be a mom. I wanted to have kids. I wanted to raise them in God's Word. And so I thought, okay, cool, I can plan now. So we're going to have a kid within 2 years of Elmarie, because that's the perfect plan. No. Now that I have it, no. And I had this all planned out. Well, we had Elmarie. 2 years later, we have been trying and nothing. Things were just getting worse again. And so I finally go in and they go, "No, you're not going to do this. You'll have to have medical help." And Daniel and I looked at it and said, "Well, that costs a lot. And we have one child who we love and adore, And God may be able to bring us another child somewhere along the line, but we can't justify the cost at this point. So we went away on a weekend trip a few months later. And during that weekend trip, we were preparing for our first credentialing service. It was kind of our celebration that we were finally making that step. And in that time while we were away, we also spent some time in prayer. And in that prayer, I heard distinctly God say, I have a plan for you. You will have your son. And I said, okay, but figured there's other ways and it wouldn't happen. So fast forward a month later, we're at district. And all of a sudden, anybody that's been pregnant knows that when you sit, there's that sense sometimes any smell can make you just die. That entire service, I was dying. And I was like, how is this? What's going on? I can't eat at Wendy's anymore because we went there and afterwards, and oh no. Came home, nothing. So waited a few weeks, still nothing. Nothing's happening, and all of a sudden, we got that positive. And I was so ecstatic. Then a few months later, we found out that we were having that little boy. And it was so joyous, such a miracle. And he drives me nuts. He's a 3-year-old with lots of personality. But I wouldn't trade him. And then a few months later, after he's born, surprise, little Miss Chantel comes along. God blessed us. He opened the doors. On that day, though, I dedicated my son. When God told me that I would have a son, I dedicated him to God. I said, if you do this, I will raise him in your way, and whatever you ask of him, I will help guide him to. And this is what Manoah and his wife go through. Here they are, they're living in a land that has turned their back on God. They have no idea. They don't have church services. They don't have parenting seminars. They don't have anything to tell them how to raise their child in God's way. They're excited, but they don't know what to do with a son that has all these rules and regulations that they need to follow. And so they talk to the man of God, and it turns out, as we look at it, it is actually Christ before the Christmas story come down to help them guide their son. He talks with them. He tells them how to raise him. He tells them to raise their son as a Nazarite. Now, not as a Nazarene, but as a Nazarite. There was a commitment that was, if you go into Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 21, it says that they are holy to the Lord. They have to abstain from any wines, any fermented drinks, no contact with dead bodies. I think that's good. And they cannot cut their hair. Now, normally, it was a short-term commitment made by an adult. This was not something a child was supposed to do. It wasn't supposed to be something that was done, but God needed Samson to be set apart and prepared to be holy. And he was born to lead. He was the only judge that was pre-planned to lead the country. All the others stepped into leadership when God called them. Samson was born. He was a foreshadowing of our coming Messiah, Christ, who we'll celebrate here in a few weeks for his redemptive plan. It was not just Samson that had to live this holy life. His mother had to proceed through this too, all the time that she was there. Now, here comes the part where sin still steps in. Samson still was human. He was not God. He was a human being. He still made mistakes. Actually, as we will continue the story of Samson, we'll see that he basically spent his entire life combating and fighting the boundaries of those restrictions. Everything he knew, he fought against. God still used him. He killed thousands, hundreds of thousands of Philistines in his actions. But it wasn't necessarily the way God would have preferred it. He chose his own path, and he was a little bit on the bad side. He really wasn't that great of an example of what to do. I think a lot of times, I know there's a couple of us that grew up as pastors' kids or grew up in ministry. And the image of a pastor's kid is they're either really good or they're really bad. And even as you go through that, you go through times where you're like Samson. You know, a lot of times pastors' kids are expected to become pastors. Now, some of us decide to do that. Some of us are called to do that. But a lot of times we all fight that call. None of us want it necessarily. It's a call that we fight against. So I can understand Samson. He was called from a young age. From before he was born, he was called to do something, and he fought against it. We're called to do something. Because the story didn't end with Samson and his failure. It concludes with Christ and his success. And the fact that God has redeemed us through Christ. God's redemption plan for us is even when we're feeling rejected and incapable of reaching him, that he steps down and fills that gap for us. Ephesians 1:7 says, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace." Grace, amazing grace, how sweet the sound. It pulls on us, it tugs on us, it redeems us. God stepped down so that we could be redeemed, because we can't do it. Every time Israel turned away from God, it was a choice, but they really needed someone to step in that gap to help them find that, because you can't be perfect on your own. You can't be made perfect without Christ. Titus 2:4 says, "Who gave himself for us to redeem us from every lawless deed, to purify for himself a people for his own possession, zealous for good deeds." God redeemed us because he wants to be in relationship with us. He redeemed us so that we could be his children, his loved ones, his bride. And it goes beyond that, because Christ redeemed us in a way that silver and gold could never redeem us. When John Newton was redeemed from slavery, it was by money and hard work. It was by salvation. When he was redeemed to true life, to real, perfect love, it was a redemption that was bought by the blood of God. Christ was the perfect plan, and that plan was foreshadowed in multiple stories throughout the Bible. God redeems us through Christ's sacrifice. But what does that mean for me and you, and for each of us, and for those that we will see come into our church? It means that we have to accept that redemption. And then we have to share it. Yesterday, despite all the chaos at my house, Daniel made sure that I could go and get my massage that I had set up several weeks ago from Groupon. I'm cheap. I go to Groupon for my massages, and I had been setting this up a couple weeks ago, knowing that today was happening. No idea how crazy it was, and I've been really working based off of conversations that we've had as a staff and as a board to really work at trying to enact something new in my way of communicating with people about God. This gal is lost. There's no question. And hurting and fighting a lot of different battles that I could actually relate to from my own life. And as I left, I took a page from the book of Mark Bain, and I asked her, and I said, "Kelly, can I pray for you and your sons this week?" And it was amazing because, Mark has told us that happens and people don't turn you down, and he was right. God opened a door. I spent the entire time praying that I would have those words. It wasn't easy. It wasn't natural. I'm an introvert. I do not like telling people in point-to-point conversations all of this stuff. It's unnatural. But God used that day, that experience, those words that have been just gnawing at me, to help me realize his redemptive act. I have no idea how much influence it will have. But I know I started a relationship with someone, and it can grow. as I conclude, I want to tell a story. It's a story from a man by the name of Paul Lee Tan. He says that A.J. Gordon was a pastor in a church in Boston, and he met a young boy in the front of the sanctuary carrying a rusty cage with several birds fluttering nervously. Gordon inquired, "Where did you get those birds?" And the boy replied, "I trapped them out in the field." "So what are you going to do with them?" "I'm going to play with them, and then I guess I'll feed them to the old cat." So Gordon offered to buy them, and the lad exclaimed, "Hey, mister, you don't want them. They're just little old birds. They can't sing very well." And Gordon replied, "I'll give you $2 for the cage and the birds." Now, the little boy isn't going to turn down money. He probably wanted to go buy those M&Ms or something at the store with it. So he said, "Okay, it's a deal. You're making a bad bargain, though." So the exchange was made, and the boy went away whistling, happy with his shiny coins. And Gordon walked around to the back of the church property, and he opened the door of the small wire coop and released those struggling creatures. The next Sunday, he used it as a sermon illustration. And he talked about how Christ coming to seek and save the lost and paying for them with his own precious blood. "That boy told me the birds were not songsters," said Gordon. "But when I released them, they winged their way heavenward, and it seemed to me they were singing, 'Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed.'" Karen, would you come up and start? Are we going to be like the people of Israel, always calling for redemption until we lose faith, until we lose hope? Or are we going to share God's redemptive plan and see it in our own life? I have to remind myself that I am redeemed. I am redeemed by God. It's something that I have to share, that is exploding from my heart. The further and further along in life I go, the more I want to share my story. The more I want to tell people about God's work. Are we like Samson, who is put in place for a plan, and then we step back and we try to do things our own way? We try to do things in a way that pleases us, but has no heavenly reward. And when we come to our children, are we like Manoah and his wife who seek God's help? Are we seeking God's help to raise our kids to love God, to raise our grandkids, to raise those other kids around us who may not have that? Are we working to raise them to be redeemed? Are we teaching them God's word? Are we raising them to pray? We need a praying generation. We need a redeemed generation. After last week, on Sunday, I'm sure most of you have seen the news, I spent hours crying over a church I've never seen, a people I don't know. But all those children, all those people who were harmed and changed. But as I read some of the stories, I was reminded of God's redemptive work. There is probably some anger, but there was a lot of redemption in that story too, where they stepped up and they tried to protect each other. Someone else came in to help. We are redeemed. We are called to help others. As we get ready for next week, we have an opportunity to share God's redemptive plan, to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to take something that excites us, to take something that grows us and bring it to God, and to know that He's going to touch lives Sunday. He's going to touch lives through each of us this week, that we can speak up, that we can say, "I want to pray for you," or "Can I tell you my story?" As we close, I'd like you to take a moment, and if you feel led, to come up to the altar and just pray that God would redeem you and then use you to be redemption, to use you to help others find God's redeeming love. And then as we finish, I'll have Pastor Kevin come and we'll gather around the altar as a family. And we will pray for each other and for this coming week as we prepare for an awesome opportunity. So bow your heads and let's take a moment. And if you feel led, please come up and pray.